Very random, but today I want to film a video of me talking about something that I read. So, anyone that knows me knows that, or has spent time with me on psychedelics, will know that I love fractals. And I've been very into fractals for quite a while. Ever since I started... my earphone's falling out. Ever since I started programming, I do maths. That was like one of the most fun things I could do with a program. You know, like make something to draw a certain fractal. For example, the Mandelbrot set, or like space-filling curves such as like the Koch curve, the piano curve, Hilbert curves, etc. I find them very mesmerising to look at, first of all. They're incredibly beautiful things. They're also really easy to construct with a program. And I mean, that is a lot of the allure of fractals in general. Very simple kind of constructions, very simple functions being iterated over and over again can create these like wildly bizarre and immensely detailed portraits. And it's pretty cool. In general, like, I guess something simple plus infinity often gets pretty complicated. So yeah, I like fractals a lot, and I'm currently doing a project at UBC right now where we need to, write a paper, not a paper, like a research paper, not a research paper, just a normal paper that's about 20 pages long on fractals. And I've done something similar to this before. I've done a project on the Mandelbrot set before, but I started reading about it more, and I became quite interested in the person it's named after, Benoit B. Mandelbrot, who is kind of hailed as the father of fractals, but I never really looked into that before. I'd heard whisperings that Mandelbrot coined the term fractal in the 70s or whatever, and I had heard that before, but I never really understood, that's mental. He's invented this word fairly recently in terms of maths, and therefore, before this kind of umbrella term existed, fractals weren't very studied at all. There's special cases of things which were studied, but never as a topic in and of itself were they ever studied until Mandelbrot kind of wrote his book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature. Sorry, this is very, I'm doing this ad hoc, is that what you would say? I don't know. But yeah, I started reading The Fractal Geometry of Nature today, and as I said, I've had knowledge about fractals in the past, quite a lot compared to the average person, and even quite a bit compared to some people in my courses, but not expert knowledge or anything, obviously, because I'm an undergrad. And the things and he writes about fractals and the insights he gives are just amazing, especially with the relation to nature. So I was kind of hoping that I could make it to Wreck Beach either today, probably not today, I've got a meeting for a trip that I'm going on, but maybe another day when it's sunny, I'd like to read the book at Wreck Beach out loud. Maybe that's quite wanky, but I hope it's not wanky, because I was reading it in the library today and I was just like, this is so well written, especially for, a mathematician. And I think, even though tons of people have read it, it was very popular at the time, I think it deserves to get read out loud, because it's quite poetic, insanely insightful, and I would bet the majority of people that I know have never read it, because it's slightly dated now. I think this book was written in the 80s. So yeah, because I'm just walking somewhere right now and I can't really walk and read a book at the same time, I guess I won't start yet. I guess I'll blather on more about it, and I can cut this video if I want. So I guess I'll give an overview of what fractals are. Now, it's quite annoying to talk about fractals because you believe it when you see them, but fractals are objects which in some sense are, for lack of a better term, infinitely rough, right? A lot of the shapes and geometric objects we're used to, lines, cones, circles, squares, etc., these are all shapes which exhibit the property of smoothness, And what do I mean by that? I mean that when you zoom in on them, you get a magnifying glass out, you look at them, they look, I believe, linear on a magnified scale, right? If you look at a very small segment of a circle, it appears linear, like a line. Sorry, that's a really jarring noise. I'm gonna move. Okay, it's pretty noisy, but I'm just walking through campus. It's gonna be noisy wherever I am. So this is why I've got the tiny mic, because I'm that generation that uses the tiny mic. But yeah, where was I? Yes, things which are smooth, and we kind of all know what smooth is, in some sense mathematically, and I'm probably not giving an accurate definition, but for all intents and purposes it works. When you zoom in, it looks linear. For example, a curve which is differentiable is said to be smooth. And we know that. Like, what does differentiable mean? It means that every point on the curve has a tangent line. And a tangent line is effectively a linear approximation of the curve we're looking at. Right, so if you've got a curve like that, then at some point here, the tangent line is there, and that tangent line locally approximates the curve. So the curve is smooth. Now, we already know of curves which aren't smooth everywhere. A very simple one is just, this like kind of box line, right, like an absolute value, y equals absolute value of x. That is not differentiable at 0, and therefore it's not smooth. So in some sense, we already have quite a good idea of things not being smooth. And yes, I've kind of lost my train of thought, but fractals are shapes which aren't smooth at all. No matter how much you zoom in, they're not differentiable in a sense. They don't exhibit linearity on a local scale as you magnify in. They're fucked. They're like really weird and infinitely detailed, infinitely jagged. And I think one of the first ever fractals was an example of a curve which is continuous everywhere but nowhere differentiable. So what does that mean? Well, mathematicians obviously knew of curves which were not differentiable, for example, the absolute value of x, like I gave, but they assumed that continuous curves, i.e. curves which you can draw without lifting your pen, there's no jump discontinuities, it never shoots off to infinity, these curves can have at most a countable number of non-differentiable points, right? Like a countable number, or technically speaking, a measure zero set of points, which are basically on a jagged corner, i.e. they can't be differentiated. The curve can't be differentiated there. Weierstrass, what was his first name? Weierstrass. It's not Carlos. I can't remember. But anyways, Weierstrass came up with a function called, I think now, the Weierstrass function, which was an example of a continuous curve which is differentiable nowhere at all. I.e. every point is very jagged, and if you look at it, it is a fractal in the sense that as you zoom in, it's infinitely detailed, right? There's just it's jagged all the way down. In some sense, it's like the absolute value curve had a baby with a sine curve, and the baby is non-differentiable everywhere. It's kind of what I would describe it like. And yeah, it was a very early form of fractal, although the word fractal didn't exist at the time of its discovery. So yeah, fractals have existed for a while, and they're often, so the Weierstrass function in particular is often given the term a pathological function. It's pathological, it's monstrous. In a sense, it's a very special, weird edge case which doesn't align with how most of maths is, or what we care to think about. And to kind of come back to my point, Benoit Mandelbrot, in his essay, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, and it really is an essay rather than like a research paper, it's like a book designed for people of some scientific expertise, but not necessarily an incredibly strong mathematical background. Oh god, it's storming the wall right now. This is dire. I'm going to skip this, this is annoying. So I ran into a friend there called Arsh. Where was I? Yeah, Mandelbrot talks about how, yes, these like pathological examples of sets and curves and general shapes which have these really weird kind of like non-smooth properties, they're pathological. That's what mathematicians have always said. I think people laughed at Weierstrass and said his construction was like egregious to mathematics. I swear Poincaré said that or something. I'm gonna have to fact check that though. But yeah, like in general, whenever pathological examples of sets and curves have been built in mathematics, there's been quite a large like disdain towards them from fellow mathematicians. And the really interesting thing that Mandelbrot writes about in this book is that these pathological monstrous functions are not special weird edge cases that we need not consider because they're just annoying for our general framework of maths, but really they are actually the best descriptors of the reality that we're in. For example, everything basically on screen right now, although it's an iPhone 7 so it's pretty bad camera quality, it's kind of fractal-esque in the sense that these branches, you zoom in and it's very, very detailed. It is not smooth at all. And you might think, well, what happens if we zoom in on a stick? What happens then? Maybe that's smooth. But no, we then know that, branches have cracks and weird things all over them. And really, it's detailed and rough and non-smooth down to the atomic level, because that's the very nature of atoms even. So fractals, maybe unsurprisingly, are actually a much more effective descriptor and model of the things in our natural world, which is precisely the kind of name of his book, the Fractal Geometry of Nature. So that was probably quite jarring, that last part, like with the camera. I need to get a better camera, it's so annoying. And yeah, like these are things you notice all the time, and that's why, maybe I put my neck on the line and go, that's why natural things are so beautiful, because they contain infinite detail in kind of a pop math, non-rigorous way. Like, that's why I personally really enjoy looking at naked trees with like their branches against the sky. I don't know if you can see it right there. I love that. I actually love that more than a leafy tree, even though leaves are probably examples of fractals as well. I'm trying to walk to a mountain right now, but as I'm thinking about it, this mountain isn't very fractal-esque. So yeah, I'm very excited to read this book out and share it, because I think it's very well written, especially the introduction. But it also just surprised me slightly, because I've always liked fractals, but I've always thought they're quite. I've always known that like a Romanesco broccoli is an example of a fractal. The coastline of Britain is a fractal because its length cannot be measured, which is an interesting fact in and of itself. The coastline paradox, check it out, which Mandelbrot wrote about, by the by. But I kind of didn't realise they were so effective at describing the real world, and really we should kind of chuck out all of Euclidean geometry, and instead you trust and use fractals more. But it's really cool. I always thought they were very artificial. For example, when I'm programming the Mandelbrot set or Julia sets or random curves, it's like, this is beautiful to look at, but it's computer generated graphics. But no, in a really amazing way, it's very natural, and I like that a lot. And I just like that I've come across this book which is tying maths and nature together in a kind of not rigorous way, but a much more believable way than when people talk about the golden ratio and stuff. Like, I've never really seen too much basis for it. But fractals, on the other hand, he makes a very good case in this book that they are surprisingly efficient descriptors for reality. And I'm in a period of my life where I'm living in Vancouver, one of the most beautiful places in the world, and it's just nice that as I'm experiencing mountains in the sky, in the sea, in the coastline, and hell, I'll say it, like psychedelics, which are kind of pseudo-legal here, and you obviously get quite trippy fractal visuals from them, like that's a known quantity. It's weird that I'm also doing a project on this, and I kind of started the project knowing that fractals were trippy, like that's kind of why I like them, but I kind of didn't realise how intrinsically linked it all is, and it just kind of, it's really, really nice, like, way for it all to come together, especially near the end. Maybe it's not the nicest day, to be honest. I'll try and get more footage / cut in footage of other times. But yeah, lots of lovely branches against the sky. There's the mountain in the distance. Oh, one other thing that he talks about but doesn't really define is the idea. He tries to give some sort of definition for fractals, because for me, and for Mandelbrot, I presume, and many others, you kind of know one when you see one. That's typically, it's easier to categorise something as a fractal or not a fractal when you look at it, rather than give a strict definition for it, because I believe when you do give a strict definition, you end up cutting out some pathological or edge cases, funnily enough. And you're kind of excluding these objects, which are cool, from the cool club, and no one wants to do that. But yeah, a pretty good definition for fractals is a shape or object whose Hausdorff dimension strictly exceeds its topological dimension. And I would have to do a technical explanation of it. I actually don't know how to intuitively explain, but basically, when something's Hausdorff dimension is kind of more generalized version of something called a box counting dimension, and basically it just asks, like, how efficient is this shape when scaled at covering the kind of space in which it's embedded. So like a square, right, as you scale it, it will like cover 2 dimensions of space exactly, and therefore it's 2D. Whereas a circle embedded in 2D space, as you scale it, it's only kind of covering, it's not covering an area, it's only covering like a line. So in that sense, it's 1-dimensional, not 2-dimensional, despite it being embedded in a 2-dimensional space. There's a more technical definition to talk about, like open covers. I would need a board for that. I feel like I've kind of butchered that explanation. But fractal dimension, things with a fractal dimension that's greater than a topological dimension, they're kind of covering a shit ton of space for what they are. And, you know, you get things called space-filling curves, which is like a line, a drawn line, which fills all of space. For example, I imagine the Hilbert curve has Hausdorff dimension 2, but topological dimension 1. It's a curve in this, and it's a line, so it's definitely 1-dimensional. Right, you can draw it with a pen without like filling, but it covers all of. If you drew a Hilbert curve in a unit square, it would cover the entire square. So its fractal dimension is 2 dimensions. It covers a shit ton of area, and that's basically what fractal dimension measures. How good is this thing at covering area as it's scaled? I'm gonna give a better example, but what time is it? Okay, this is probably a dry run of me trying to read this, like with some nature. You can't really see much, but there is meant to be the scene sky in the background, but no. But yeah, nonetheless, let's read Mandelbrot's introduction. This is chapter 1. It's called Theme, and the book is called The Fractal Geometry of Nature. Why is geometry often described as cold and dry? One reason lies... This book is very old, and it's not very old, it's 1983. Kind of old, depending on who you ask. And I got it from the UBC library, so it's kind of tattered. Sorry, I'm going to start again. Why is geometry often described as cold and dry? One reason lies in its inability to describe the shape of a cloud, a mountain, a coastline, or a tree. Clouds are not spheres, mountains are not cones, coastlines are not circles, and bark is not smooth, nor does lightning travel in a straight line. More generally, I claim that many patterns of nature are so irregular and fragmented that, compared with Euclid, a term used in this work to denote all of standard geometry, right? So, like Euclid, for those not in the know-how, was a mathematician who kind of wrote a book called Elements, which was like, I think it's the best-selling maths textbook of all time. Weirdly, maybe not selling's maybe not the right word, but the most published or read maths textbook, and it basically kind of defined all of, well, Euclidean geometry, like planar geometry. Famously had the parallel postulate, which is like two parallel lines in Euclidean geometry will never meet, which kind of sounds like it should be an axiom. And I think people often wonder, like, does it need to be an axiom, or can we prove it from other axioms? But it turns out it needs to be an axiom as far as I'm concerned. That's the parallel postulate. I might cut that out because I might be spreading false news there. Anyways, so yeah, he uses Euclid as a term used in this work to denote all of standard geometry. I continue with the quote. Nature exhibits not simply a higher degree, but an altogether different level of complexity. The number of distinct scales of length of natural patterns is for all practical purposes infinite. The existence of these patterns challenges us to study those forms that Euclid leaves aside as being formless, to investigate the morphology of the amorphous. Mathematicians have disdained this challenge, however, and have increasingly chosen to flee from nature by devising theories unrelated to anything we can see or feel. Responding to this challenge, I conceived and developed a new geometry of nature and implemented its use in a number of diverse fields. It describes many of the irregular and fragmented patterns around us and leads to fully fledged theories by identifying a family of shapes I call fractals. The most useful fractals involve chance, and both their regularities and their irregularities are statistical. Also, the shapes described here tend to be scaling, implying that the degree of their irregularity and/or fragmentation is identical at all scales. The concept of fractal, or Hausdorff dimension, plays a central role in this work. So I'm pretty uncomfortable, to be honest. I continue. Some fractal sets are curves or surfaces, others are disconnected dusts. And yet others are so oddly shaped that there are no good terms for them in either the sciences or the arts. The reader is urged to sample them now by browsing through the book's illustrations. Sorry, I need to change the page. Wait, why have I not just been doing this? That's so much better. Now I have the book lying down, and I can squat. Here's a wee fractal. Many of these illustrations are of shapes that have never been considered previously, but others represent known constructs, often for the first time. Indeed, while fractal geometry as such dates from 1975, many of its tools and concepts had been previously developed, for diverse purposes altogether different from mine. Through old stones inserted in newly built structure, fractal geometry was able to borrow exceptionally extensive rigorous foundations, and soon led to many compelling new questions in mathematics. Nevertheless, this work pursues neither abstraction nor generality for its own sake, and is neither a textbook nor a treatise in mathematics. Despite its length, I describe it as a scientific essay because it is written from a personal point of view and without attempting completeness. Also, like many essays, it tends to do digressions and interruptions. This informality should help the reader avoid the portions lying outside his interest or beyond his competence. There are many mathematically easy portions throughout, especially toward the very end. Browse and skip, at least at first and second reading. Okay, now I'm talking. I love that so much. Like, that's so well written and not wanky for something which is very mathematical. Like, the fact that it's designed for people who aren't mathematicians is just great, and that's coming from someone who does have an okay understanding, and I think that's so cool. Lots of fractals in the back, in these clouds. They might seem... Oh shit, the book is flying away. Hold on. Oh. Okay. He can digress, but I clearly can't. Yeah, I'll just continue. I can always cut if some sections aren't interesting. The substantive topic is occasionally esoteric. In other instances, the topic is a familiar one, but its geometric aspects had not been attacked adequately. One is reminded on this account of Poincaré's remark that there are questions that one chooses to ask and other questions that ask themselves, and the question that had long asked itself without response tends to be abandoned to children. That's such a good quote. I've probably butchered the telling of that quote, but it's a banger by Poincaré. To be honest, I don't want to read the next part. I now want to go on to the next subsection, which is titled A Manifesto. There is a fractal face to the geometry. There is a fractal face to the geometry of nature. Now the reason for bringing these prefaces together is that each helps one to understand the others because they share a common mathematical structure. F.J. Dyson has given an eloquent summary of this theme of mine. Fractal is a word invented by Mandelbrot to bring together under one heading a large class of objects that have played an historical role in the development of pure mathematics. A great revolution of ideas separates the classical mathematics of the 19th century from the modern mathematics of the 20th. Classical mathematics had its roots in the regular geometric structures of Euclid and the continuously evolving dynamics of Newton. Modern mathematics began with Cantor's set theory and Peano's space-filling curve. Historically, the revolution was forced by the discovery of mathematical structures that did not fit the patterns of Euclid and Newton. These new structures were regarded as pathological, as a gallery of monsters, kin to the Cubist painting and atonal music that were upsetting established standards of taste in the arts at about the same time. The mathematicians who created the monsters regarded them as important in showing that the world of pure mathematics contains a richness of possibilities going far beyond the simple structures that they saw in nature. 20th century mathematics flowered in the belief that it had transcended completely the limitations imposed by its natural origins. Now, as Mandelbrot points out, nature has played a joke on the mathematicians. The 19th century mathematicians may have been lacking in imagination, but nature was not. Why am I getting cold? Shit. Sorry. I'll restart that paragraph. Actually, do I have time? I have 5 minutes. I'll quickly read this part. This is probably a dry run, so it doesn't matter. But now, as Mandelbrot points out, nature has played a joke on the mathematicians. The 19th century mathematicians may have been lacking in imagination, but nature was not. The same pathological structures that the mathematicians invented to break loose from 19th century naturalism turns out to be inherent in familiar objects all around us. And now Mandelbrot returns. In brief, I have confirmed Blaise Pascal's observation that imagination tires before nature. Another banger of a quote. And then he gives the French quote, but I'm not going to even try that. Nevertheless, fractal geometry is not a straight application of 20th century mathematics. It is a new branch born belatedly of the crisis of mathematics that started when Du Bois-Reymond, 1875, first reported on a continuous, nowhere, non-differentiable function constructed by Weierstrass. That's what I was talking about earlier. The crisis lasted approximately to 1925, major actors being Cantor, Peano, Lebesgue, and Hausdorff. Because basically, tons of theorems had been published with this kind of axiomatic belief that you couldn't have a nowhere differentiable continuous function, but in fact you very much can, as Weierstrass and others showed. These names and those of Besikovich, Bolzano, Cesaro, Koch, Osgood, Sierpinski, and Urison, probably butchered that, are not ordinarily encountered in the empirical study of nature, but I claim that the impact of the work of these giants far transcends its intended scope. I show that behind their very wildest creations, and unknown to them and to several generations of followers, lie worlds of interest to all those who celebrate nature by trying to imitate it. Once again, we are surprised by what several past occurrences should have led us to expect, that the language of mathematics reveals itself unreasonably effective in the natural sciences, a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. We should be grateful for it and hope that it will remain valid in future research and that it will extend, for better or for worse, to our pleasure, even though perhaps also to our bafflement, to wide branches of learning. How good is that quote as well? It's so true. Yeah, so I'll need to read over that, or watch over that, and see whether any of it made sense, or is good, or I spoke too quick, or was not enunciating correctly because of my stupid accent. Oh, there's a squirrel burrowing. I never see that. He's actually trying to plant an acorn. That's so cute. Yeah, I'm in the completely wrong part of campus. I'm going to be late for this meeting. Yeah, where was I? Yeah. Fantastic introduction. There's more to be said, more to be spoken about. In terms of he explains why, or how he coined why he termed the coin. Yeah, I swear, not usually this inundated with calls, but clearly today, naturally I am, as I'm trying to record. Yeah, he then goes on to talk about how he came up with the term fractal, so I'd really like to talk about that because etymology is such an interesting thing to me, and he's clearly a bit of a beast at it. It's funny, he's called a polymath, and like at first I thought that meant he does a lot of maths. But a polymath is someone, I think, that gosh, it's really windy. A polymath is someone who is skilled at a very great number of things, not just maths. So clearly he's a bit of a linguist as well. Yeah, I mean, he's French and Polish and speaks/writes excellent English, so, you know, Mandelbrot's got it going on is what I'm trying to say, and I'd like to talk about more later. I wish I had like a fucking tripod and I could read this out in front of the Wreck Beach Sea, but maybe that's just a bit of a pipe dream. But I'm glad I am recording this as is, because yeah, it's just a great book, and a wonderful introduction to the Fractal Geometry of Nature, so I'll leave it at that. Sorry to harp on even more, but there's just one final section that I wanted to include, which I talked about earlier, and that is, you know, how he came up with the word fractal, and I find it very interesting indeed. He says, "There is a saying in Latin that to name is to know, nomen est numen. Until I took up their study, the sets alluded to in the preceding sections were not important enough to require a term to denote them. However, as the classical monsters were defanged and harnessed through my efforts, and as many new monsters began to arise, the need for a term became increasingly apparent. It became acute when the first predecessor of this essay had to be given a title. I coined fractal from the Latin adjective fractus. The corresponding Latin verb frangere means to break, to create irregular fragments. It is therefore sensible and how appropriate for our needs that in addition to fragmented, as in fraction or refraction, fractus should also mean irregular, both meanings being preserved in fragment. Brackets, since algebra derives from the Arabic jabara, which equals to bind together, Fractal and algebra are etymological opposites. This guy was an etymological genius.